can see there. I have the pleasure, and hi folks that are streaming in and all that. I have the pleasure of introducing a special guest here. Justin is a FIEA. He currently works at Bethesda. I'll briefly tell you a little story that happened when he was getting hired. He interviewed with a gentleman named Joel Burgess, who at the time was heading up all the level designers at Bethesda. They were working on, Elder Scrolls and Fallout, back and forth, every other one, back and forth. And so Justin was interviewed, and he blew Joel Burgess away. And by the way, Joel Burgess, you'll hear from in a couple, sometime in November, we're rescheduling him. He was the one who was set to speak to you when Hurricane Matthew decided to speak to you instead. We're trying to reschedule him, but you'll hear from him as well. He's at Ubisoft now, and so he's the world director there, heads up all their open world stuff. So he is going to be talking to you. He hired Justin, blown away by Justin in the interview. Now, Justin at the time did not have a whole lot of actual, like, in the weeds, in the trenches level design experience. And that was the kind of role he was being hired for Skyrim. And so they gave their normal test, which is using their tool. It's called GECK, the Garden of Eden Creation Kit. This was from Fallout 3, so I joke from Fallout 3. Later it was like the Skyrim Creation Kit. It's just this Creation Kit?
Now just Creation Kit, yeah.
It works for both games in that sense. And so he absolutely tackled that tool. He learned it super fast, made an awesome level in it. A really interesting concept. He and I had conversations about this level, like what are you going to do? And he eventually created a game where the people that you were meeting in this vault that he built, you eventually discover that they're androids. They're not actually human, but the mystery and the unraveling of that was interesting. And he explored themes of what it means to be human and so forth in that process. And in fact, I noticed that in Fallout 4 there was also some robotic human.
Not my doing, but.
So I worried, like, is that Justin again? No. He not only created a great level, learned the tool really fast, but even created something that made you think and made you want to play the game. So at that point, Joel's like, I already loved you. I already wanted you to come and work for us. Now you've shown how well you can use the tool. Get in here. So that's how he went from FIEA to Bethesda and been there ever since. What cohort were you?
5.
5. So he's been there a while now. And so as you can imagine, he's gained a lot of knowledge. But he's spoken for us once before, did a great job, and he's made even more enhancements to what he's going to talk about. So I know you'll enjoy it. Join me in welcoming Justin Schram.
Hey. So yeah, he said kind of everything I need to say. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my experience. So my first project was Skyrim. Worked on over 40 different dungeons for that. I was sort of thrown in the weeds there, learning how to make games. But then I ended up working on the DLC, and I got to work on some major parts of Dawnguard and Dragonborn. And then we started on Fallout 4 and immediately rolled on to the DLC. My first DLC was Automatron, which was a pretty small DLC. I actually only built one dungeon for that, but it was the best one. So, and then my first project as lead level designer was Nuka World, which was an awesome experience. I got to sort of design and pitch that from the ground up, and it's sort of designed a theme park, especially coming from Orlando, was kind of like a dream come true. So yeah, that's what I did. So I've been there for about 7 years now. So I'll tell you a little bit about, there we go, what we do at Bethesda as a level designer. So we build dungeons, obviously, like levels. But we also do POIs. So those are like little points of interest on the map, little interesting things to find. We do a lot of environmental storytelling. Random encounters, we do a lot of procedural content in the world, so the level designers will build like a frightened woman coming up to tell you about her god she's going to be sacrificed to or something. We do exterior gameplay spaces, so like cities in Fallout or random camps in Skyrim. We actually do quests, so any quest that happens within the domain of a level, we do. So we get to write a little bit of dialogue, we get to script. We also develop game systems. So on Fallout 4, I actually developed 3 of the perks, the hold-up system. So Animal Friend, Intimidation, and Wasteland Whisperer were these perks where you could get an enemy to not fight. You could essentially pacify them. I was trying to make a non-combat sort of play style. So that's something that was available to us at Bethesda. We script features, traps, so lots of script writing for various things, for time sequences in a dungeon. And then we also do kit development, which I'll talk a little bit about later, but that's how we build our dungeons at Bethesda. We have these modular kits full of pieces, and we help the artists build those from the ground up. And then also tools development. So working on the editor, we're responsible for making our own lives easier. So the kit and the tools that we have to build with, we have the ability to go to the tools programmers and be like, hey, could we have this feature? Or this is very inefficient. How can we make this better? So you see at Bethesda, level designers have a lot of hats. It's not the same everywhere. I mean, there's varying team sizes. So, for example, at EA or Ubisoft, you have huge teams, thousands of people working across different studios. You're not going to get to wear as many hats. You're going to be a lot more specialized. So you might be just the person laying out an experience or writing. But also the genre of the game highly affects how you're going to be developing levels, whether you're making a linear experience or a non-linear experience, like Fallout or Skyrim. Also, the engine in the editor is going to hugely change how you work. If you're working on something like Unreal, you don't have the flexibility of making your own life easier like we do at Bethesda, where we made our own tools. And then you also have additive versus subtractive design, which is going to make a huge difference. So Unreal, you actually sort of like carve out rooms. Some of you have probably used it here. But what we do at Bethesda is additive design. So we're actually putting the pieces in and building from the ground up, like with Lego blocks. And then sometimes we have different technical proficiency requirements. So at Bethesda, we script, but at a lot of studios, you might just be in the design stage of things. You might be writing things down or building. So, every studio is going to have different expectations for what a level designer is, but it's good to have the skills in all of those worlds just in case you might need them. So level design involves the whole team. You're not working on your own. You kind of can't make anything on your own. So one of the biggest things that I mentioned is you work on making the kits. You're working with environment art. You will write up requests for things you need in a dungeon. If you have a specific story you want to tell, at the beginning of the project, we write up art requests, and you just have to be very detailed in what you're asking for to get what you want. We're also working with the landscape team to build the exteriors of our dungeons. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. Character art, we need, the enemies you're fighting, we're working very closely with how you develop what their behaviors are and how they react to the player in different ways. And also, if you have a special character in your dungeon, we're going to have to work with environment art for that. Effects artists, traps, different spells you want to invent, puzzles, random explosions for whatever reason. Again, character animations, quest design. So quest design, they do all the writing in our games and all the storytelling. And so a lot of times they will have a quest send the player to your dungeon, and you're going to have to work a lot with them. And also, again, I talked about random encounters. We also have radiant quest systems that will put random quests into your dungeons. You have to work with quest design on that. Tools programmers, again, tool development, talked a lot about that. AI goes back to characters and encounters. Sound requests are a huge thing, goes right in with art requests. And then you actually work a lot with QA. So sometimes if you get a bug and you don't understand it, we can go right down to the QA development house and just ask them what's going on or ask them to reproduce the bug for us. So, and that's, again, we're lucky to have our QA in-house. Not every studio has that. But you're always, as a level designer, you're kind of the last-ditch effort. You're like the last person. You get everything in and you present it to the world. You take everybody's work, you put it together, and you try to put the best foot forward for the game. So, to start off, when you're designing a level, I think the most important thing you need to know about your game is your verbs. So the verbs are, what are your main mechanics of the game? How is the player able to interact with the game world? Are you just carrying a gun around and shooting everything? Are you able to lockpick? Are you sneaking? These words, especially your main ones, are the verbs of your game. These are the main ways you're going to be traveling and interacting with the world as the player. So in Fallout, we have exploring, we have looting, we have shooting. So every space we build serves the verbs. And you try to remember everything the player can do. You want to serve every type of player, especially in a game like ours where a player is building a character. You want to serve everybody you can. So just try to keep all those in mind when you're designing a space. So I like to think of level design as a sort of role play as your character. Well, it requires you to see the world through your player character's eyes. So you take the verbs that we took from the last exercise and you try to sort of like figure out how you would marry that to an environment. So what I like to do is just try walking through everyday places that I go through on a daily basis, walk through the city, walk through my studio, and keep my player character in mind. So how would I change this space or enhance it or add to it to make this space fun for my player character? Like, what are the things they do? How would they see the world? And how can you put little things in? What is the most fun version of this environment? And that's what I try to think when I'm building an environment from scratch as well. So I like to think of it as after I played Tony Hawk back in the day for the PlayStation 1, I would go out in the world and I would just look for, like, I would see grinds, I would see tricks that I could pull off on everything. And that's sort of the way you have to look at the world. You take your player and you look at ways to string things together and do combos or like find places to sneak through, like in an Arkham game. So, like, you take these characters, they all have distinct ways of looking at the world. They have distinct ways to interact with the world. And so you would build very different spaces for all these characters to interact with. I mean, like Link has, puzzle solving, and he has his hook shot, so he's going to be looking for places to string up. Whereas Commander Shepard can't even jump, so he's going to have a flat environment, Corvo, he could teleport anywhere, so you're going to have to build a very extensive environment for him because he could end up on the roof, he could end up in any little niche in your level. So we'll talk a little bit about layout design. The first thing you're going to do is sort of decide on the features. So you took those verbs, you took the sort of space that will be fun, and you're trying to marry that with how you're going to be laying out the level. So one of my favorite types is actually the hub, which you can see on the top in this Hagrock readout on the top. So the idea of a hub is that it has a central location that the player is going to be returning to. So I really like this because you get a lot of mileage out of the main large chamber. And then you're sort of like going to these branches to retrieve something, maybe for a puzzle, you're retrieving parts of a thing, but you're always coming back to this central environment. So you get a lot of use out of it, and it also incentivizes you to put a lot of detail into that main room, because you know the player is going to be seeing it from multiple angles. In games like Fallout and Skyrim, we do a lot of branching in our levels. Actually, another really good example of this is Dishonored, because they try to give you paths for every different play style. So a sneaky guy will have a different experience than the guy who goes through killing everybody. So you give them different branches. And then, is your dungeon linear? A lot of story-based games have very linear-based layouts. And like the hub, for example, is not, because you could go to any of those spokes in any order, just as long as you do them all. And then verticality is something that's very important as well that you don't see in these sort of like flat layouts. But verticality means that you're going to get a lot more mileage out of one room because you're coming at it from different levels. You're also thinking a lot about the dungeon exterior. In Skyrim and Fallout, we were given sort of what the space is on the outside. So in Fallout, you would have like, I had Suffolk Charter School, which is this elementary school on the southern end of the map. And so you sort of know what a school should look like on the outside. And we build that, and then you sort of have to match the inside to that. So when you're designing a level, you have to remember this has to look on the inside what it should look like on the outside. So that's something you have to keep in mind. Also think about your space in relation to other spaces in the game. We want to have a lot of variation in our games. They're open world. So we don't want every space to be linear, but we also don't want every space to be open. So try to keep a balance in a game like ours of variation in layout so the player doesn't know what to expect. This is actually something we kind of fell victim to in Skyrim. We had this one feature where when you would get to the end of the dungeon, it would loop back to the entrance. Every dungeon did it. And it was great because it means you don't have to double back through the level, but it created this very predictable experience where, okay, well, it's going to loop me back at the beginning, and there's the front door, and I'm out. Like, there's nothing surprising about that. So it was a strength, but it's also a weakness. You want to have a little bit of variation. But always keep your verbs in mind. That's the most important thing. That is God. The space should respect the verbs. But also you're going to consider your encounter type. So in Fallout 4, we have spaces with ghouls. Like that school I told you about was full of pink ghouls because they ate this food replacement paste that turned them pink. But they're a melee encounter, so they're only going to be able to run at you and swipe, whereas the raiders can shoot at you from a distance. And that is going to hugely change how your space is built. So that's something you want to think of right at the very beginning. What are you going to be fighting when you're in here? In the early days of layouts development, we keep things very loose. It's just boxes, rooms. We keep the detail very low because we want to be able to change it as much as we can throughout the development process. So we try not to put in what we call clutter, which is small little trash that's laying about a room. Just boxes, just rooms, not even really honing the shapes yet at this point because you're just trying to get the experience of how it feels to walk through this space. And it's going to change a lot, and I'll tell you more about that later too. Okay, so here I'll get to a segment I call super secret proprietary vocabulary words. They are these words that we sort of use at Bethesda that aren't well known, but I'm trying to make them well known, so I'll try to get them out here. So the first one that relates to layout design is what we call Snoopy's Doghouse. So Snoopy's Doghouse is a signal that the layout's interior isn't matching its exterior. So in the Snoopy universe, the Snoopy canon, his doghouse has this huge interior that's like a mansion inside, but outside it just looks like a freaking doghouse. So this is most important right after a load, which our games have a lot of. So you'll walk in a load door, you see like a high school with a little entryway, and you see this little protrusion, and you walk in and you see this huge freaking big chamber that's not going to match up. So you want to make sure that the player's expectations of what they're going to see from what they saw on the outside of a building matches what they see immediately after they load in. It's not as much of a problem in a game without loads, but it could still happen. Dark Souls is actually brilliant in the way they lay out their levels and the way things sort of overlap and connect to each other. But they do have these sort of weird impossibilities where things don't actually work if you were able to consider it. But they're able to pull it off because you don't see things in the large view as much as you can in an open world game like Fallout. But it is a problem. Actually, if you look at the way Dark Souls laid out their levels, they actually had to disable whole parts of the world because they would overlap each other if you really laid it all out at once. So you have to be a little bit careful, but you can cheat things like that just as long as the player doesn't know. So you're trying to sell a reality but not make it actual reality. So our general rule that we use to get away with this is 70%. So you can get away with people's memory by making the outside 70% as big as the inside. So you can fudge it a little bit, but there's only so much that you can actually change. So, talked a little bit about verticality. It is hugely useful in level design. So, sick of flat, boring level designs? Try verticality. It's more visually interesting. Helps break sight lines, which is great for performance. Gets more use out of a single space. My favorite is to, in a hub layout, have a player return to a space they've previously explored but at a higher vantage. So I was talking about the way you sort of have these hubs that you keep returning to. So you keep coming to a room that's maybe very, very tall, but there's a bridge that you see at the beginning of the level, and you know you're going to get there later. And when you come back to it, you see that room that you saw earlier, and the player is instantly oriented in this space. So I love like having these central areas that the player can keep returning to because instantly they remember where they are. They have that sense of familiarity. They won't feel lost. I'll talk a little bit later about how bad it is when the player gets lost. You just want to be able to orient them as much as possible, but it's also using the art and using your time wisely because you get so much more use out of this one space that you build instead of having to build multiple huge rooms. So I have a super secret level design trick here. So after you make your layout, play through it backwards. Sometimes things work better backwards than forwards. It's always better to see your design from a different vantage as well. Sometimes a player will get turned around and they will play through it backwards, so it's very important for you to know. It's really easy as a level designer to play through your spaces and know how it's supposed to be played and only play through it that way. So it's good to change things up for yourself and try to take it at a different angle. Oftentimes you'll like a room better backwards and you might turn the whole thing around, which is why we don't add a lot of detail so you can do stuff like that. So I want to talk a little bit about navigation and not letting the player get lost. So I like to think of every view that the player can have in a level as an image, just a flat image. And I try to make every view give a navigational cue. So this is my dungeon in Fallout 4. It's called the Big Dig. You explore a subway as you're digging through it and opening things up. So you can see one of the cues that I have here is this rubble on the subway platform here. So, you know, it's not subtle, but the player doesn't think about it. The player's not like, oh, the designer's telling me I need to walk up here, so I'm going to walk up there. It's just like, it's a subtle cue that this is the way you need to go. Another way we do that is rubble. So you see we have the rubble up in the corner here. The player instantly knows when they see that rubble is sort of a cue that don't go this way. It's destroyed, it's whatever. So we try to remove a lot of those options subtly. Like the player doesn't feel limited. The player doesn't feel like we took options away. We're just trying to tell the player, hey, maybe just don't go this way. It's not that important. So like I said, I use clutter to point the way. Another thing you're going to want to do is just watch people play. See where they get turned around, see where they get lost, see where they take a path that you don't want them to take, and add those cues in just to subtly guide them. If you notice, like maybe there's a corner of the room that you don't want the player to go to, fill it up with rubble. Lighting is also extremely useful here. So as you see, I obviously want the player to go to the left here and not the right. Like the lights are here. So, things that are lit, the players are going to be drawn to, just like a moth. And avoid overclutter. If you have too much clutter on the floor, if you have just everything is covered up, they're not going to know where to go. A lot of times we'll draw paths on the floor with areas that aren't cluttered. So we'll have just like trash all over the corners everywhere. But there will be sort of like a winding path through the room where there is no trash. And the players just take that as a cue without thinking about it as like, oh, this is the path I need to take. So I have another vocabulary word for you guys. It's called the decision stack. So every time a player comes to an intersection, they keep the path that they have not taken in mind. So as you see, you get here, there's a way to go right and a way to go left. This, they take the left infinitely. But the player's always going to remember the way they didn't take. The further they get into the layout, the more angry they're going to get that they didn't take that other path because they're like, oh, it dead-ended, or there's loot there, or there was something awesome, and I didn't take it. And they're getting further and further into the layout, and they're like, oh, what was back there? And they build this like huge fantasy in their mind, and eventually they turn back, they double back through your layout, and it turns out to be a dead end that they didn't know was a dead end, and then they hate you. So the fantasy is in the unknown for the player here. So you don't want the player to double back a lot of the time, unless you do, but that's usually a special case. It interrupts the flow of your layout. You've placed encounters throughout your golden path, and you wanted like this certain rhythm, this certain flow to it, and then they're going to double back and go to this dead end. So every option that you give to the player in a layout adds to this stack. So if you keep coming to these like three-way or two-way intersections, and the player keeps making a decision, and it keeps branching and branching, the player stacks up their decisions that they didn't left on. They're sort of like adding this like, oh, I need to go back and see this. I need to go back and see this. So you just need to be very aware that you're creating this. So the trick here is to communicate to the player instantly when they see this two-way intersection, which way is the side path. Show them the dead end. So it's like, again, rubble in Fallout 4. I would, at the end of one of these hallways, just have a little bit of rubble spilling out. Just so they're like, okay, that way we'll dead end. Maybe you can put some loot back there. But anything that looks like an option, even if it's not, will frustrate the player and add to the stack. And they will see paths everywhere. So it's up to you to sort of tell them where the real paths are. Crisscross layouts also alleviate this. So you can do all this branching, but if they keep branching and then returning to these shared spaces, kind of like the hub, then the player will be more comfortable. They can come back to this room that they're familiar with, see the branch, follow it, and they're like, oh, it leads back to this decision point. So I really like to do a lot of crisscrosses. It adds choice for the player, but it doesn't make them feel lost. So a little trick that sort of breaks all those rules is I like to lead a player to a dead end using navigational clues, and then get them to turn around to take a new perspective on the space. So I call this the fake door. So it would be as if if the player came into this door and encountered this room, and where I want them to go is out that door. But the first thing I see coming into this room is that door. I would go all the way to the back of this room and inspect it. Maybe it's locked, or maybe it's rubbled out, maybe there's nothing back there. But then they turn around and they see this other door that they didn't see coming in the room at that angle. So it's a subtle little trick you can use to get them to see sort of every part of the room, because a lot of times players will just make a beeline to the door that they think they need to go out of. So we want to talk a little bit about environmental storytelling. So in Fallout 4, you're given a dungeon. It's a sewer, the Fen Street sewer, which is right next to Fenway Park. You have the opportunity to tell a story by just building a sewer. So that's the entrance to Fen Street sewer there. So every space has the opportunity to tell multiple stories, especially in a world like Fallout. Because you have, what was it before the war? What was it in the 200 years in the middle? And what is it now? Like, what are the stories that took place in this huge span of time that this space existed? But there's another level of storytelling there, and what is the player's story that they're going to have as they're exploring this space? They're going to have their own experience that may or may not mesh with the story of what happened here. There's also overt storytelling, which is the sort of what is it now? If there's characters living there that you're talking to, or a quest where things are happening now, that's more overt storytelling than it is environmental. But it will also make a space very more alive for the player. So this also makes the world feel like it's a real place, because that's how the world works. Everything existed as something before and something now. And the more details that you can give the player to learn, the better and more memorable it's going to be to the player. So for the Fen Street sewer, it's not just a sewer, it's a serial killer's murder hideout, where he built these sculptures of the people he killed. And you listen to all these holotapes about he lured a detective down here and told her about his murders, and you get to the end and you find out that he murdered her and made a sculpture out of her. And it's this cool thing, and a lot of people have created like fan theories about this, and it's sort of resonated with people. It's this mystery they want to solve. And this could have been just a sewer you go in and fight feral ghouls, but there was another layer of what happened here before, and it makes it a memorable space. So, just try to think, like, how can I make the player remember this space? How will this stand out against everything else that exists in this game? So you're also trying to help, like I said, the player live their own story, that they're sort of the god. Like, you want them to feel powerful. You want them to be living in this world and their character to be just living and having their best life. So one of the best ways you can do this is through pacing. So a dungeon experience can follow a standard story structure. Think of it as the story the player writes as they play through your level. So you want these sort of like ups and downs of action and exploration and just this rising action, that's sort of this tension that you're building as a player plays through your space. So often the climax is a boss battle, like you get to the end and there's a big boss. But it doesn't have to be. That doesn't have to be your culminating experience. You're just trying to find ways to heighten the player's experience to a full conclusion. So you're building. Think of it as just anything you're introducing to the player in a dungeon, just drop it. Just give them a little taste of it at the beginning. And then as you go through, build it up and up and up until you get to this big climactic moment. And you can do this through puzzles. You can do it through storytelling. It doesn't have to be just combat, which is the easy thing to fall back on, and it's something we do often. I mean, every dungeon in Fallout 4 has a boss. And then the resolution, which you see at the end here, comes usually from giving them a reward or just some sort of culmination of a story. Just some way to sort of come down and return to the rest of the world after they're done playing through your space. Boop. So when we're making a game, we want to look for something called flow. So flow is this guy, I never remember how to say his name. I think it's Csikszentmihalyi. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. So you're basically trying to get out of anxiety and out of boredom and in this middle state where time just goes by for the player and they're just enjoying themselves. So you're trying to avoid this sort of steady level of frustration or boredom. Anytime you introduce predictability, that leads to boredom. So you want the player to never really be expecting what's coming next, which is sort of what the leaky faucet is. But it's also important in navigation. You want to make the player work a little bit to find their way, but you also want to guide them using the subtle nudges that I sort of talked about before. But you never want them to feel lost because that gets them into anxiety or frustration territory. But if it's too easy to find their way through, they're just going door to door, there's no challenge to it, they're going to be in boredom territory. And there are ways the layout doesn't have to take the full brunt of this. Combat will add that level of interesting, the sort of flow to it. But then you sort of have to share the spotlight between layout and combat and puzzle solving. You have a lot of different tools, and you just want to use them in conjunction with each other. And using them all at once leads to too much. So you have to stay in this middle point where the fun is. But good navigation design should fade into the background. The player shouldn't know they're being guided around a space. So as you're designing a level, you want to know where the hotspots are. So the hotspots are sort of collections of loot or a room with like really intense combat where you're getting shot at everywhere. Those are those sort of spikes on the story chart. But you want to also sprinkle in the downtime, which is these sort of dips and valleys, places where it's just a room that you're exploring, or you're reading through notes, or you're listening through a holotape. So that you want to play with those ups and downs to keep the player in that flow. So a good way is just to have a really cool, interesting vista or some environmental storytelling, and that'll always be a nice downbeat. Because you don't want your downbeats to be boring. You just want them to be just to have like a little breather. Same thing, like I said about clutter before, it can be distracting to the player layout-wise, but it's also just overwhelming to look at for your eyes because your eyes are going to be darting around the room. It's also more effort for the player. The player is going to be spending more effort there. So that will be an upbeat, a really dense room. So a downbeat would be a room that's a little more open with just one thing to look at that takes all the visual interest. So another vocabulary word for you guys. This is called the sandwich rule. So after a load screen in a Fallout game, or any of ours, the player should be able to get up and make a sandwich with no fear of being killed. Like you should be able to be, okay, I saw a load screen, I'm going to make a sandwich. So it's just sort of, it's this downbeat of players need a break. They should have reasonable expectations for when they can put the controller down, especially if you're making a really long dungeon experience. So we have the advantage of doing loads for this. A lot of times we'll break our dungeons up into multiple loads just to have this happen. Because we might not need it for performance reasons, but we have this expectation of you load into a space, you're not going to get shot at, you're safe in this area, you put the controller down, take your little break. So it's a good way to just break up the whole experience for the player and make sure they don't get sent into that frustration category. I mean, this can also work in games without load screens. The bonfires in Dark Souls, which I keep talking about, I noticed, but I love that game, so it's okay. But the bonfires in Dark Souls, you know if you're going to be sitting on a bonfire, you're safe. You know you can't get attacked by a player. You have this place where you can have a breather, especially in a game as intense as Dark Souls. But all you're trying to do here is encourage that flow state. Because the player that wants to keep going, keeps going. They can stay right there. They're not going to be in boredom just because you gave them a load. Well, during the load screen, but we don't want to use that. So another proprietary vocab word is the leaky faucet, which I talked about a little bit earlier, but specifically referencing combat pacing. You don't want your dungeon to have a steady flow of combat encounters. If it's just shoot a thing, shoot a thing, shoot a thing, shoot a thing the whole time, that's going to get boring. That's going to be too much in your frustration level. The player is going to have to be like on his guard the whole time they're in there. So there should be highs and lows. The lows are just as important as the highs to keep the highs more interesting. Predictability is the enemy of fun here. So another thing level designers are responsible for is performance in their space. This is the, how fast it works, the frame rate, whether or not your game's crashing. So at Bethesda, we track object count and polys per view. So objects is just basically the amount of things we've thrown into space, and polys are the amount of polys per object, which you're probably familiar with. Those are the things that affect performance the most. But lighting and effects are also a huge concern. So putting mist or clouds or flames in a space is going to be a huge tax on your engine. Even having too many lights on one object, especially shadow lights, can slow you down. Another thing you're going to want to do, this actually leads to your layout design, you're going to want to be thinking of this from the start, is avoiding really long sight lines. The longer the player can see, the more objects and polys are going to see at once. So you're going to want to break up your level in as many ways as possible. You still want to create really interesting vistas, but you don't want to have really long sight. So in a hub room that I was talking about earlier, if you enter the big hub chamber, which is probably a dense, interesting area to explore, going to be high polys and objects, if you enter through a hallway, you can see the entirety of that hub space room. You don't want to be able to see down another one of the spokes into where that leads, because that's going to add all the objects and polys of that other spoke to the amount that you're having to render for this big hub room. So you want to just find ways to break that up. And so one way is the dog leg hallway, which is just taking your hallway, turning it this way, and then turning it this way, because there's no way you can see all the way down that hallway. It's just an easy way to break up a sight line. But they tend to feel unnatural, especially in a place like a building. So find ways to fake it. Maybe don't have it be an architectural element, but maybe using rubble or a destroyed wall that you have to go through to get through a space. Just anything you can do to break up a sight line, try to do it. Also find ways to partition denser areas. So like those hub rooms I was telling you about would be a very dense area. Find a way of making that its own area of the dungeon that you don't see from everywhere else. And then also limit the amount of actors, because the amount of actors, this could be combat encounters, but also people that are traveling with the player, they're going to be very taxing, especially having to run AI procedures. So yeah. So I was telling you a little bit earlier that how we build at Bethesda is using kits. So we work at the beginning of a project. We know which kits we're going to have. So for example, Fallout, we had the building kit and the industrial kit and the sewer kit. At the beginning, we're developing that. We're working, level designer and artist will meet every day, see how the kit's coming. And so these are great for open world or procedural games. We're going to be creating a lot of content out of a limited palette of art. You have a lot of mileage that you're going to be getting out of this stuff. So this is the Dwarven Ruins kit in Skyrim. You can see it's just a lot of little pieces, and this is actually probably a quarter of that kit. It's huge. There's so much stuff that you're building out of. And this came out of an artist having a vision for how a Dwarven ruin is supposed to look, but then a level designer being like, we need to build this, and it needs to be easy to understand. We need to know how to snap these pieces together, and we're going to have certain uses. For example, these are platform pieces that are going to give us that verticality we're sort of looking for. So we could have these big open rooms, and then these platforms that the player might not be able to get to while walking around the edges, and know that they'll be able to return to later and come back into this space. So those are the types of things we talk to kit artists about at the beginning. It's like, we need ways to get verticality, and we need ways to get the player to change levels. So we like have them do stairs. We need bridges to get them over different spaces to bridge these sort of vertical areas. We need elevators. We need all this stuff. And it's the type of stuff that is worked on in conjunction together. So it leads to, building something like this. We have the platform. We have these pillars. We have these pipes. We have all these interesting ways to build our space. And no two Dwarven dungeons, I mean, they look alike, just in style, but they're not the same in layout. We have so many infinite ways to build interesting layouts out of just, a few pieces. So it's really great to build an open world game because you get so much mileage out of just one effort. So on the other side, in a more linear game, so this is how Valve builds a lot of their stuff, is gray boxing. So the level designer in a gray box development will build just out of geometric shapes with a gray texture like this that usually has, how big the item is in units. And you lay it out that way just by building with primitives your layout, which is great for really rapid agile development because there's no art time that went into this. There's very little level designer time. It's all about the layout. And then the artist will come in and do the art layer and add detail. But everything that affects layout, everything that affects navigation, everything that affects combat would be put in by the level designer. So any of these shapes here that you could use for cover, level designers would put in. The artist is not supposed to be adding anything that will affect the gameplay to this. It is purely visual at that end. So it's a good way to build linear games. It's a good way to build very specific spaces because you're going to get a lot of art detail, a lot of specific assets that are just unique to this space. Whereas with kit development, you're not getting a lot of unique assets, but you're getting a lot more flexibility in your designs. So the last thing we sort of come to as a level designer is how to get our spaces feeling polished. And again, we work with a lot of the team to do this. We're not in a vacuum. But the goal is to put a spotlight on what is working in our spaces and what isn't, but also in the entire game, what is working and what isn't. What mechanics are starting to gel together? What is the game good at? And what is the game maybe not so good at and we need to take the spotlight off of? This usually comes at the end of the development process, when you have to make these decisions. Something Todd Howard says all the time, our great games are played, not made. You're going through the game and playing it and seeing what works and seeing what's fun and seeing what flows and seeing what feels good. This applies to the whole game, but also your level. So another thing we're trying to do is, like I said, you get used to playing your level a certain way. So get other people to play your game, especially people with a fresh eye. Just as many people as you can to play through the level, and also lug bugs along the way, because you're going to be trying to find ways that the game isn't good at this point, and you need to find ways to fix it, so you're going to log bugs. But just the more people you could get to play it, the better. You also have to be really comfortable cutting things when necessary. A puzzle isn't quite up to stuff, just get rid of it. An art request got cut because the art schedule is going over. Make do without it. Make your level work without that piece of art. If a whole side branch of your dungeon layout isn't working or confusing the player, or players are continuously getting lost in it, be comfortable with just getting rid of it, because it's putting the spotlight on something that isn't working the more time you spend on that extra branch. Think about where the spotlight should be. Every time you're fixing something that isn't good, you're taking time away from polishing something that could be great. And don't fall for the sunk cost fallacy. Like, don't think about the time you spent making something, because if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and it has to go. Think about the game. So playtesting is very, very, very important, real important. The faster you get to the place where you're playtesting and you're playing the game how it should be, the better your game's going to be. It's just, there's nothing else that is going to help your game more than getting people to play it and seeing how they play it. And so if your schedule makes you just working on the game right up until you're about to ship and you don't build in playtesting time, you're going to lose most of where your game's going to be fun. It's sort of that 80-20% rule. That last 20% is going to be the most advantageous for you. So the first 80% is just making the game, but that last 20% is polishing it. And you're only going to get there by having people playing it, especially people that aren't you, people that are not developers on this game. So, as I wrap up here, I just want to remind you that every decision you make as a designer, especially a level designer, affects your player. Game design is tango, not a solo dance. So keep your player in mind. You just want to make sure you're giving the player a fun time. Like, that's the goal of making a video game, is you want them to have fun and enjoy this experience. So just always remember them. Remember that player character. Remember the actual player sitting on the couch and how they feel as they're playing through this space, because that is the ultimate goal of making a video game, is keeping them entertained. And so remember that while you're building stuff for them. So just want to wrap up, and if you guys have any questions, I'm here to answer anything you want about anything I've worked on or about anything in the industry or level design. So any questions? Yes?
So how do you gather inspiration that you get while you're outside looking at buildings? How you can your Tony Park thing that you mentioned, or Tony Hawk,
yeah.
Sorry. How do you gather that all? Do you take pictures of the locations and then put it inside a folder on your computer, or what do you do?
Absolutely, but I also I think of it as a very actory sort of thing. So I do a little bit of theater and improv work, and so I sort of think of it as getting into the character's head and thinking like them and trying to see the world how they would see it. So it's more of a feeling thing because I don't necessarily want to recreate spaces that exist in the world, although that helps quite a bit. But it's more just what are the elements that are going to be really helpful for making a fun space for them. So just like looking, in a real space, like if you go downtown Orlando and walk around and you see this really cool like set of counters and rails that would lead to an awesome grind, and then you could take that inspiration and put that in. So yeah, I would totally take a picture of that. Right here.
You mentioned having to make a level sort of based around a character sometimes. So when you have a game where you can choose the abilities they have and stuff, do you guys max out the character and then place them in the environment to see how they interact with it?
Oh, absolutely. So we'll often have QA send us saves of multiple character builds so that we can play through our own spaces as these differently built characters and really feel how it takes a lot more time to playtest, especially in our games, because we have so many different abilities and so many different characters. Like we added a freaking jetpack in Fallout 4, which was the worst for us because we had to account for all these new spaces the player could fly up in. Then we had to test it. Like every level we had to play through with the jetpack, and it's like, God damn it. But we're right here.
I was watching a story talk with Emil, and he said that when Bethesda made the decision to change the dialogue system, a lot of the quest designers and the level designers weren't happy because a lot of times it led to like under designing. You had to fit everything into 4 dialogue options, or over design and the character says the same thing 4 times.
Absolutely.
So how did you deal with that, and like how did your teams deal with that, and also what happens after when that system is one of the more controversial opinions?
So for a level designer, it made writing dialogue take a ton more time. So it actually ended up discouraging a lot of the level designers from adding dialogue and characters to their dungeons. Because in Skyrim, if we wanted to throw a quick character in with just a linear dialogue progression, we just write that up, and it was fast. But in Fallout, we ended up having to write 4 options, and they had to branch, and they had to feel meaningful. And I think the intent when designing that system was we wanted the player to feel like they were guiding a conversation and changing it. But in the end, with the designers, we just were sort of filling them out because we had to. So it ended up making that system feel just linear in the end, which is what we were trying to avoid. But it's just because we have so much scheduled time to build a space, and we have to partition out, like I want to do my layout, clutter it, and make it feel fun. And as soon as you add a character, that's going to take time away from all that. So it was just a trade-off we had to make. But we learned from it, and we're taking the feedback that we've heard from a lot of people and adapting and moving forward. It was an experiment we tried, and it worked in some respects and didn't in some others. Here.
I know you guys do iterative passes, and I was wondering what you do with the sound designers, like when you're working with them.
So it's very interesting. So the sound designers at the beginning of a project are usually working on our vertical slice or our main path. So anything that is major and in the player's face that we know about from the start of a project, the sound designer is instantly part of that. And so, they have work throughout the whole project because later on, the level designers don't know until late in the project what sounds they're going to need. A lot of that comes up at the end. So there's this steady train of work for the sound designer because at the beginning they have all this work that was accounted for, and then all the sound requests come in, and then by the end of the project it's like, oh my god, this trap that we have is silent and we need sounds for it. So a lot of it gets pushed to the end because of that stuff, which means a lot of work for the sound designers. We used to only have 1 on Skyrim. We had 2 on Fallout 4, and now we're up to 3 in our sound department because it's becoming that more evident that we need that many people. So it's definitely something taken into account at every step of the way. Right here.
So when you're starting to develop the level, I know you use like the gray boxing and the proxy art to like get everything put where you want. When do you start actually putting in the art?
So in the gray box process, so the gray box process, it's pretty instant because so for like EA or Ubisoft, you'll gray box a level, but you're doing it at the very beginning knowing the artist who's going to be responsible for the space. So it's this really agile back and forth between the two. So the level designer will build it maybe in like a day because gray box should be really, really quick. And then the artist does their pass, and then it goes back and forth. Between the two, they both have complete ownership over the space. So it's going to happen instantly, and there's going to be this really quick back and forth. I mean, it does start with the level designer, but the artist should be involved as soon as possible.
Yeah. I think riffing off of that question, are you primarily like gray boxing, or then the art does their pass and you're kind of working with the assets they put in the game? I understand like the iterative process that would make sense to be going back and just continually expanding your dungeons and levels. So are you like mostly gray boxing?
So yeah, I mean, at the beginning, it's mainly you just sort of on your own in the gray box process, because the kit process is only the level designer. But with the gray box process, at the beginning, it's just you. You're just laying it out. But the artist will also have a say maybe on how the level plays out. But after the art starts getting involved and things get more and more set, especially as like art becomes more polished, the level designer will be responsible for playing through it and finding maybe new options, new areas that you need to build, or taking certain areas out. So it's the level designer's sort of ownership of the gameplay of that space. And so you'll be playing through it a lot and making lots of changes. But your job's not done after the initial gray box. Right here.
What would you say is the most important, or possibly 3 most important things that Bethesda looks for in a new hire?
Okay. Well, actually, I will say, at the beginning, Bethesda was a pretty small team, relatively to a lot. So we're just 100 people. The level design department at one point was just 7 guys. So the number one thing is just sort of an attitude, and sort of like being able to fit in and your personality sort of working in. Like the talent comes, and the talent is very important. But if you can't get things done with the team, it's like I said, it's a team sport. You have to be able to work with a lot of people. So not even just getting along with other people, but being able to go out and get what you want and talk to other people and communicate with other people. So it's definitely the people skills. Yep.
Just so I understand this clearly, but the difference between additive and subtractive level design, is additive like where you kind of have like a set base and then you add stuff to it?
So additive is as if you're starting with a void. There's nothing there, and then you put something. It's like, let there be light. Like subtractive is like you have everything is something, and you have to cut it out and carve it out. Over here.
For scripting all the dialogue within your levels, do you ever take into account the portrayal of that the voice actors do, or do you just?
Yeah, actually. So we do all our voice acting out of Los Angeles. We have a studio that does it there. And the person who writes the dialogue is usually sitting in on that session over Skype. And so we will be able to give them feedback on pronunciation, pronouncing things, or their read on certain things. But actually, their directors are amazing. And they read through. So we give them a quest synopsis, and then the directors will read through it. And they usually have this awesome grasp on the entire game and where your quest fits into it. And they'll usually like give a comment before I even have a chance. So I'm just usually sitting there. Every once in a while I'll say something, but the directors usually have a really good grasp on that. But we do have that option if we need to. Back here?
Where does lighting come in the whole process, and are level designers really involved in that?
So we do temp lighting in our first few passes. We have about 4 passes through where we're building our spaces. So we will place lights, but when the lighting artist comes in, at the studio specifically, they'll just delete everything we did. So they do their pass, but then there's another pass where we play through the level again, and maybe they didn't light a path we really needed them to. And so we have that option of sending it back. But yeah, the lighting is usually really in the artist's domain. Yeah.
Hey, I have an online question.
Cool.
What's your process for initial layout?
For what?
For the initial layout.
Okay. I don't know. For me, it's like riffing. Sometimes I try to find something that'll interest me. I've built so many buildings that I just try to find ways to make it interesting to me and therefore interesting to the player. So it's sort of like playing with Legos, especially with kits, because with gray boxing, you have so much control that it's actually overwhelming. So with a kit, it's like playing with Legos and just building these interesting shapes out of rooms. So I just kind of have fun with it. I don't know. That's what I do. I just sort of have like Lego time with myself and enjoy it. Right here?
Can you talk a bit about how much time you tend to spend on any given task, how often you're switching between different things, and so on and so forth?
I mean, there's two levels of that. So we have our macro tasks, which are, we have this software we use called Test Tracker. We have due dates, but usually that's like, okay, you're working on this level, so I'd be working on Fenn Street Sewer, and that would be due Friday. But I know that I want to be writing the holotapes for that, and I want to be doing the clutter, and I want to be sort of like, I have all these like sort of micro tasks that are part of that, and so that is all on ourselves. A lot of times, the layout and the core gameplay experience comes first because we need to make sure that works. That is the absolute most necessary thing to play through it and be interesting. So oftentimes the first thing we'll go if we run out of time will be that story layer, which is unfortunate. I wish we had time to do that everywhere. And we're trying to improve on that with our scheduling. But that's also on you, is scope the space so that you have time to make everything you need. Like if you're making an area that's too big, you're going to run out of time. There's a lot of people that put in a lot of overtime because they overscope themselves and build these ridiculously huge spaces and then run out of time to add in that level of detail that really fleshes out the world. Right here?
At Bethesda, where there's so many like side quests, is it more common to start with a quest and say like, oh, how can I make a dungeon for this? Or to start with like build a dungeon and say, oh, this would be a cool place to find paint cans. This guy needs paint.
Yeah, I think, again, there's two levels of that. So at the beginning of the process, the quest designers are off writing the major quests of the game and the major side quests. And they will see the list of spaces we're working on and like grab them. And so like we'll have this sort of like bidding process where they're like taking all the spaces of the game. But the level designers, we have the ability to sort of at the beginning of our development process be like, I want to like have this cool gameplay experience, this cool little quest in this space, and we can kind of reserve it for ourselves. So there's two different things happening there, but so it's a little bit of both. But it always starts with the dungeon first, because like I said, that space existed as a real space before. Like it had its own story that we're adding on to. So that's the first thing that you do. Back here.
Have you about designing large open worlds, like you section off areas that you're going to build and put them together? Like how do you...
So Fallout 3, was the first time that our studio tried to do something like that, and they built DC. And they ended up like partitioning the neighborhoods into these loaded world spaces. So like DuPont Circle would be a different section than Bethesda, which is a city in Maryland. And then you have to load in, and it's this big world space. That was a failed experiment. They admit it there. It was really hard to navigate through. And so coming into Fallout 4, we decided we were going to build the downtown Boston open, no loads. It was extremely challenging. We had a lot of performance issues, but in the end, I think it really paid off. But the thing you have to think of is all those same performance things. It's like, how do you break sight lines using these big buildings, and which buildings can you load into, and which buildings are dense and full of clutter, and which buildings do you have a bunch of combat encounters in? So you have to keep all that in mind and sort of partition them out. So we have this grid-based world space system, and you have 5 grids loaded at a time. And so we have to constantly, as we're building in a 5x5 grid, know what exists in any given 5x5, because as the player travels, that 5x5 is going to shift. So it was a huge challenge. I think it paid off. I think it's really fun to play through downtown, but it's a lot more work, especially to make it run. So it's something you have to think about.
Speaking of performance issues, do you guys, as level designers, when you're setting everything up, if you have those issues, do you go to the artist to try to make like the polys lower or something like that?
You have that ability, especially if an asset is way over budget, but most of the time it falls to you first. So yeah, it's usually if there's a problem asset, then you'll go to the artist, but otherwise it's up to you, and usually that means cutting a lot of things from the space and trying to reduce that as much as possible, which is often very painful because sometimes something will look really cool and you have to take a lot of the detail off, but you got to do it to make the game work, and that's the most important thing. Right here?
So in vanilla Fallout 4, because I unfortunately haven't played the DLC yet.
That's fine.
What are your 2 favorite dungeons that you did, or that primarily you did?
I mean, I think I showed them here. So the Big Dig, I really like. I got to write like a full suite of characters for that, and I had this really cool sort of interactive layout where you're sort of digging your way through. So I really liked that. That was an experiment. It was going to be much more Minecrafty. It didn't get that far. But I like how it turned out. And then also the Fenn Street Sewer, I just thought was a nifty little self-contained dungeon experience that I was very proud of.
Did you also work on Dunwich Floors?
No, but I'm very familiar with the guy who did and that space. That's definitely falling in that Lovecraftian Fallout Legacy.
That was a very expansive one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we had a good amount of those. What else? Right here?
So I know it's been asked a few times, kind of, but when you go to start a level, do you just jump straight into the engine, or do you actually like draw it on a napkin? You know what I mean? Like, what's your process?
We just jump straight into the engine. We don't have a lot of paper designed. We have what we call a pass zero. So that is just a write-up. So that's a few paragraphs on what happened before this space was destroyed and what happened, and just a big write-up on this, and then you're also gameplay goals. But that's where it lives, just because we have the ability, how we do our work, to sort of sketch using kit pieces. Even if we don't have the kit we want, we can usually have a kit that's pretty similar and that we just switch in at a later pass. So it's a really easy way to sketch without having to go to paper. It's just not a necessary step for us. But for a place where you're gray boxing, I would definitely recommend drawing it out first.
I just want to get clarification. Like, if you have a flat space and then vertical space, if it has the same amount of stuff, the vertical one would be better for performance?
Well, it's not necessarily performance. Actually, you're probably it's gonna be a little more problematic for performance. I think it's just more interesting for the player visually and to explore. So, but for performance, yeah, it's gonna add some more challenges for you, because that's another level of things that you have to maintain. So you have all the objects that are rendering down here and all the objects that are rendering up here, or whatever combat experience. Another problem that it causes, I forgot to put in there, is usually if you're in one room in our games and you come in, there's all the combat encounters that are in that room are going to be shooting at you. Like, we have no way of controlling that. So all the guys up here are going to shoot at you, and all the guys down here are going to shoot at you. So we need a way for when you come back into the room to make that interesting again and to have the combat happen. So a lot of times we'll have like guys run out of another hallway or enabling guys that were initially disabled. But it's just another challenge. But it's actually harder on performance. Hey.
I know I remember hearing reports of like, oh, Bethesda guys are involved in your research. What's going on? As a level designer, I know, Fallout has the cities that have history to them, and Skyrim, they took a lot of Norse mythology. Like, when you were designing a level, do you use any of that research for inspiration?
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, tons of research. So one of the spaces I worked on in Fallout 4 was the Old North Church. So I tried as much as I could to get the feel for what that actual space was and and to honor the history that was there. I was really worried because I remember, I think it was a Call of Duty game that also used a church, and they got all this hate mail from the church and the people that went there. I was really worried about that happening here. So I was just trying as much as I could to honor what the space was and the history there. Another interesting thing about that is that there are these Revolutionary War catacombs under the Old North Church, and I watched a lot of History Channel specials of them walking through to get a lot of inspiration for what the feel is there. But the thing that you can get caught up in that you need to be careful of when you're doing that is sometimes reality will not be as fun as the space you could create. So you want to you want to have some room to sort of add that fun and add something to the layout that will make the space more interesting for your game, while still honoring the feel of what that space actually was.
You mentioned something earlier about a pass zero.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a formal set of passes that you do over these levels, that a group of steps that you tend to take every time?
Yeah, we have a checklist. So we have pass 0, pass 1, pass 2, pass 3, pass 4. So pass 1 will be when we build the layout. Pass 2 is adding in combat and adding in some of the more navigational clutter. Pass 3 is really detail clutter, and then pass 4 is polish. But we have a huge checklist that we try to maintain everything through for each one.
Do you enjoy more a mechanical level design, where you're trying to design a space that supports the play styles of the game, or more narrative and emotional and storytelling based?
Personally, I vibe more with the narrative, but I mean, you can't ignore the mechanical. Like, the narrative should never outshine the game mechanics. They should always fit in with it. But I have a soft spot for working in those sort of narrative elements to my spaces.
I know that the special edition of Skyrim's coming out soon, and I saw that it was something about the creation kit. Are you allowed to tell us about any like gizmos?
No, not at this point, unfortunately. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, no.
We're not gonna get Justin. He won't be able to come back. So let's one last question for our time here. No, I've got one. There we go.
Well, you were talking about Snoopy's dog house, right? And what's the situation in which you want to use it?
Well, so it's kind of like what I said about the Old North Church. So that's a real space. And you have an expectation for what that should feel like when you walk in. Anybody that's walked through that space knows how that's supposed to feel. But we can't build on the outside the actual size of how much that church would take up, especially in our cities. So when designing our cities, we actually had to scale the buildings down to a believable level. And we have a lot of like false perspective happening with those. So we had to build the church on the outside much smaller than I needed to have room for the gameplay experience on the inside. So that's when I would use that sort of thing. Oh yeah. So the church on the outside is a completely different asset, while the inside of the church was built out of the building kit.
Cool. Well, we appreciate Justin coming down. Let's give him another round.
Cool. Thank you.